So here we are.
At Dar Khalifa.
Hello, everyone.
The wonderful Caliph's house in Casablanca.
And you know something? I know we're going to be talking about Scheherazade Foundation. I was just sitting here remembering our first phone call that we had about it, which must have been almost 4 years ago. And we were so preoccupied by this idea of Scheherazade. And it was actually you who said, don't call the foundation the Arabian Nights Foundation, like I suggested. And you said, let's call it Scheherazade and build into it the qualities of Scheherazade. Do you remember that?
Well, she's such an extraordinary character, right? I mean, she is the main storyteller. She's the storyteller of 1001 Nights, right? So it just seemed like the perfect role model. She seemed like an amazing role model. The fact that she had told these incredible stories night after night, thereby saving her own life, because obviously the king that she's telling the stories to has this sort of bloodlust and hatred towards women, anger towards women, and she tells these stories and she heals him night after night with the storytelling, and it's it's just a fantastic...
And actually, frame and device, but it's actually thinking about Queen Scheherazade, the idea of Scheherazade, it's an incredibly complex, psychological mechanism, that the way I look at it, that I'm sure it developed, in, very most ancient times, and was developed probably by another story and then introduced to put all these stories, give them all a frame, because they're all they're all over the place.
Yes, exactly. But it's wonderful, that labyrinthine world that you enter into. The frame gives you the boundaries, as it were, but once you're inside those boundaries, you can go in any direction. And, time has no meaning and space has no meaning and all kinds of things.
And what I love is the way, there are stories within stories within stories, which is exactly how human society is. We're not just living one life. We're all living at these different, different parts of our lives. We backtrack, we forward track, we have stories within stories. And what amazes me really is why it took Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights, so long to make its way to Europe. And, because it was supposedly Antoine Galland who brought the treasury to Europe first. I don't know if that's true even, but it had been bouncing around the Near East and the Far East for centuries or even millennia.
Well, and what's interesting I've found in the past few months or so is, since we've been working on the Scheherazade Foundation, other things have come up which are very similar, which I wasn't even aware of. So there's 101 Nights, and a few of those stories are actually in the 1001 Nights, but most of them are completely different. But it's virtually the same frame story. And then there's a Turkish tale or series of tales called the 40 Viziers, which again is very similar. There's a sort of a king who eventually, after these 40 tales are told, realizes that his son, who's been accused of wrongdoing, is actually innocent. And so it's a sort of a healing process through storytelling. So it's quite interesting to find these parallels with other frame stories.
Yeah. And in a way, 1001 Nights, it's, I see it as a way that it's allowed unrelated, beads of mercury to all join up to this greater whole. And definitely in the East, it's always been known as much more than an entertainment. And the thing that I suppose doesn't surprise me was that when it was brought, the treasury was brought to Europe, because it was like blockbuster. It was like incredible. But so often it was received with one dimension, not as this multi-dimensional, multicultural, multi-everything, sort of magical treasury, but it was regarded as something which was merely entertainment. And that, it really strikes, in my head, what my dad, Idries Shah, always used to say, that the West often is a multi-dimensional organism in the West. People aren't They're not asking themselves, could this device be used in different ways? Is it more complex than we're just assuming? And that's what I find so interesting. And I think only now, really, people are looking at stories and questioning the reasons they've been honed over thousands of years by human society.
I think it's really interesting, right? You'd mentioned your father there and how the impact that he's had on the understanding of stories, I think, in the West. I remember when I was a kid, stories were just entertainments, maybe back in the 70s. But now you have storytellers working for corporations like NASA or like, I don't know, McKinsey or great, huge international corporations. Storytelling has become respected as a thing that people really need to embrace and use. And I often think that's thanks to the legacy of your father.
Well, look at this. It's no surprise that Hollywood, Bollywood, mega movie franchises, they are huge storytelling machines. And just as are video gaming platforms, what I'm so fascinated by is this idea in storytelling on media that the human brain is so sophisticated and such an expert appreciator of stories that it doesn't even need the story to be finished or even to complete. And usually, Eastern stories usually don't have a beginning, middle, and end. 1001 Nights often begins in the middle of someone else's story, and it might even carry on backwards and spew you out through a wormhole somewhere else. And I think that there's a lot to be said for video games. Okay, I'm not a gamer, but I love the way that video games use this technique of, rooting the person who's in the game through a portion of a story and spewing them out somewhere else. And importantly, when I talk to psychologists about stories and storytelling, they always tell me that the brain will make sense of stuff. It makes sense. Our dreams are this kind of mad, manic frenzy of thoughts and experiences, but at the time, they make total sense. And I don't usually remember my dreams very well, but I know just before I wake up, I'll remember the last, 3 seconds of a dream, and even that will be a tumultuous sort of wild goose chase of all kinds of stuff. And I think to appreciate stories, we have to appreciate the way the human brain works, because it's definitely not linear, and we're so much happier when something is all kinds of things, an experience. It's,
at the same time.
And it's ripped to shreds, and that intrigues us more than anything. Do you know what I mean?
And we've been talking over the past few days about the College of Storytellers.
Yeah.
Do you want to mention something about that?
Yeah. So in the 1970s, early 70s, my father, Idries Shah, I remember he was talking a lot about this idea he had to get together for a certain amount of time, but only time would tell how long, a group of people taken from randomly, and to bring them together for the purpose of telling stories and learning from these stories. He had loved the idea that this could be a kind of a caravanserai, and it could be anywhere. It could be I remember him saying, this is a caravanserai, the College of Storytellers. Whether it's in a prison yard in Lancashire, England, or on the pampas of, wide open expanses of Argentina, at a cattle ranch or anywhere else. He loved this idea that people could be thrown together randomly and share stories, whether they've invented them or they're inventing them and telling them as they're making them up as they're going along, or whether they've been retold for centuries. And I love that idea. And the College of Storytellers kept going for about 10 or 15 years as a very sort of informal fraternity of people. And in so many ways, it was way ahead of its time. It was disbanded, I remember, by the mid-80s, or maybe very late 80s. And I remember my father saying the reason he had decided for it to disband was because it had had the effect that it was supposed to have on the specific people he had invited to take part in it. And he said it was never meant to carry on forever. And people were quite angry at the time. They were like, but we've built it up. And he said the magic of this thing, rather like a tented encampment in the Arabian desert, the true magic is to disband it and for everyone to go their separate ways.
But you think that maybe now is a time to recreate the story of this College of Storytellers, perhaps in a new form?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, we've been talking about it, so share your thoughts as well. My thoughts are that when I look back at what my father was doing in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, he was working with tools which were excellent, but they were tools that, or he was not working, put it this way, he was not working with tools that we now have. We're using, a camera to record this, and we could send it right now to anywhere in the world, any community in the world digitally. 30 years ago, that didn't exist. 40, 50 years ago, it didn't. I think what's super important is to remember something. And it is that just because we've got fancy schmancy tech these days, it doesn't mean that the stories are going to be magically better or different. What's important is to take the very best elements of what has been honed by, I always think of it like stones smoothed by a river over millennia. And we don't want to change human society, but we want to offer a new way for ideas to be shaped a little bit and disseminated. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think there's an opportunity here for the College of Storytellers to do something, like you say, digitally, using the technology that's around now. And you could have that dream that you were mentioning of your father, where you've got somebody in Argentina and maybe somebody in Bangkok, and they're telling similar stories and they're sharing stories. I mean, that can actually be real, almost in real time now. You could have people telling stories through digital media and sharing stories like that. So I think it's a really exciting chance.
Exactly. Yeah. And my father's, I think probably his lifelong fascination was the idea that the same stories are told and retold all over the world. In different ways, of course, but they're not owned by Hollywood or Bollywood or anyone. They're owned by humanity, and these stories have been kind of tuned by a frequency that is humanity, and the most important thing to remember is they are not there merely for entertainment. They're there as a healing mechanism, and they're there to inspire us, to teach us, to calm us, to smooth out the bumps in the road of our lives. And that's what they do. And I'm thinking, as we roll out our vision for the College of Storytellers, I think what's so exciting is we will see what form it takes. My father's big thing always in life was, I'm going to throw these people together and I'm going to tell them some buzzwords or give them some material, and we can sit back and watch what happens. And I think often in the West, what happens too much is people all say, well, these are the parameters, this is the frame, this is what we're thinking, this is who's involved, this is the way we're going to do it, and they're saying, and this is the result that we're going to have. Well, God help us. I'm not interested in knowing any of that. I'm interested in throwing, a few things into a bucket and stirring it around and seeing what kind of soup we get.
And sort of letting it grow organically almost. Yeah. So how's that, I mean, maybe we could talk about the work that the Scheherazade Foundation's been doing with Rumi materials as well, because this might be a good juncture to talk about that. So the Rumi Readings.
Yeah. Well, let me say, and then I want to get your sense on this. My sense is, look, I grew up in a house where the name Jalaluddin Rumi was bandied around and was on people's tongues a lot of the time. But his name was on people's tongues a lot of the time, not because people were thinking about him in a sort of mystical way. They were thinking about the contribution he had made and how this could be used as a tool in our lives. And what I'm interested in partly is what's happened. And what happened was from Victorian times onwards, there were a lot of translations of Rumi work, mostly by old kind of Oxford Don types, in very flowery, unintelligible English and other European languages. And that had a place, and certain people understood it and liked it. But what then happened in the, as I think the 90s, one or two people, one person in particular, who couldn't read Persian, didn't understand a word of it, took some of this material and recast it in his own voice. In the Western world, it's been championed as the greatest message of all time. In the Eastern world, the God's honest truth is people are kind of horrified in a way and shocked because it's lost the layers. The layers of, understanding were stripped away. It's almost like taking a dish that is so delicious and stripping out, 2/3 of the taste and still applauding.
Yeah. Well, it's like there's a Nasrudin story of the soup of the soup of the soup, right?
Yeah.
It feels very much like that, or it's a sort of an echo of that. And so,
So what's your take on this?
I've because I've been working on these materials for a few months, and it's really, really interesting to see how Rumi can be so pragmatic and have such practical value, and to be so clear in a lot of his statements. Some of them are more obscure, but some of them are just crystal clear. And often when you're reading them, it's like, they really hit home. They really, really hit home on all kinds of levels. And I found it extraordinary, actually, and very, very rewarding, very rewarding experience to be going through these materials. We've had, as you know, native Persian-speaking scholars translating this material for us into English. So we've been working through the English translations and editing them and cleaning them up and making them palatable enough without losing that essential connection with the original Persian. And it's just extraordinary. Like you say,
can you describe how we're presenting them in the various themes?
Yeah, exactly, because I think this is a brilliant idea. And this was, you said from the very beginning, we need to put Rumi into a certain thematic compilations that will actually help people. So we've got, Rumi for life, Rumi for grieving, Rumi for sorrow and joy, Rumi for mental health, Rumi for addiction. We've got 17 of these editions. We've also got, so that each one has 100 quotes from Rumi, aphorisms, excerpts from his poetry, mostly from the Masnavi, his classic work. And they are absolutely amazing, and they have this sort of scatter type effect on you because they're coming from all kinds of directions, all within the same theme, but often quite obliquely. And so as you're reading through them, you're reading, I don't know, the 37th one of the compilation of 100 in that book, and suddenly it chimes with the 5th one that you read or something. These very interesting connections start to be made, almost like a constellation in your mind. And it's magical. It's fantastic. I'm really excited about this, and I know because we're going to be we've had the translations done. We're going to be publishing them very, very soon.
You know, I love this, what you're saying. I love this idea, this sense that you'll read something or hear something and it doesn't have an immediate payoff. It's almost like eating a boiled sweet that tastes okay right there and then. But then, 6 hours later, you feel the taste that overwhelms you. And I think it speaks to how the human brain works. The human brain is so non-linear. God help us. Look at all the thoughts we have. For example, I'll look at that table over there, or I'll look at that. If I look at this piece of metal here on this sofa, I'll get a flash in my head of downtown Casablanca at Marché Central of the same kind of metalwork, and that will give me a flash of a dead chicken at a stall up the road in Hey Hassani here in Casablanca. And we are being bombarded by, I suppose it's electrons or protons or something. What's interesting to me is in the West, the Occidental world, as it tries to teach and inform and guide us, it always tries to give us this linear structure, which has never ever been used by society, really. Society always begins, and I'm thinking particularly here in what you call Central Asia, or the Near East, or Far East, or beyond. It'll dive in the deep end somewhere, or they'll get a student who's learning metalwork like this and put them with a master. And they don't put people in classes like they tend to do in this society, in the Occidental society. And I think this is all part of learning to relearn and to review and view in a new way. I think this is what's exciting. And the new way, for God's sake, is not a new way at all. It's the oldest way of all.
That's really interesting, because going through the Rumi materials, I found him to be incredibly modern, for want of a better word. The way that he talks, it could be straight out of some manual for mindfulness or something that's being written today. It feels very, very modern. But then you turn that observation on its head, and you say, well, no, it's not that he's modern. It's that, this is universal. This goes back. This is timeless. This kind of thinking is timeless and has probably been with human society in some form or another since the very beginning. So it's sort of connecting with something out of time. And he himself says something like this. He said, I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember it exactly, but he says, make efforts to understand the world outside of time now while you can, before time ceases to have any meaning for you. And it's full of wonderful phrases like that. You think you are a microcosm, but look inside yourself and you are the macrocosm. You think, wow. Okay,
and as you were saying, it was incredibly important to us to go back to the original, text and to look what it said and not stray crazily from it. Not play this game of Chinese whispers, one academic translating and then another reworking it. And then, because through that approach, which is what everyone has been reading, that Rumi, they're getting something that isn't Rumi at all. They love it. Of course they love it. But the fact is, the original is mind-blowing and far more complex and interesting.
Yes.
And it's far more useful, than the soup of the soup version.
I think so, very much so. And I'm really excited about the publication of these materials. As I say, we've got 17 compilations, and then there's an 18th book, which is called The Essential Rumi Readings, which is just 33 of the kind of choicest quotes taken from the rest of the books. So that might function as a kind of introduction or a taster for the whole series. But I really think a lot of people, having been fed for so many years a kind of Rumi light, I think a lot of people are going to get really interested in this sort of authentic,
this
real
is something,
Rumi.
Jason, that we talk about a lot, you and me, and that I'm fascinated by. That my father, Idries Shah, from the 60s really onward, was preparing and kind of packaging, in a way, ancient material in a form that he thought the Western world would be able to receive. Mm-hmm. He removed certain elements from it, mostly because he would always say, when we were kids, he'd say, in the West, people are very excitable and they're not ready for a lot of things. I'll tell you this, that at our house, where we were growing up in Kent in England, he had a studio built. It was called, it was known as the tekkia, and it was in a woodland at the house. And it was octagonal, and it was made of fiberglass, and it was kind of amazing. And I've got 2 of the doors, as you know, here, and it doesn't exist anymore. And my father's idea in the late 60s was to have people do, ancient Sufi movements there and meditation. And I remember he said that when it had been constructed on extraordinary, plans and fabricated, he invited several people in to do meditation and movements. And he said everyone who was invited in on that one day began behaving in the most extraordinary and unpleasant way. And it was as if all they wanted was movement and meditation, and nothing else that he had been until that moment trying to present. So I've never told you this. So wow. It was like he was bereft because he thought people were ready for this. And he ordered for it to be closed and never opened again. And it was never opened again. And one day in 1987 at the big storm, a tree hit it, and he was rather happy about that because he thought it was the rightful end to this. It was almost like a story in its own way. Yeah. His thing was always that in the West, people don't look for the thing of real value. Mm. It's like, it's staring them in the face. And in the East, look, we're sitting here in Morocco. In Morocco, which is really this part of ancient culture, an ancient transmission route to all kinds of parts of the world, people are very good at understanding what the real crux of something is. They're very good at that. And they don't cover it in sort of chocolate sauce and then just talk about the chocolate sauce. Here, have you seen that with this culture? It's complex. It often doesn't really make sense, but it's...
Yes, and then...
It drills down.
It drills down. And also, and this is something that, you and I we experienced something like this the other day, where you're trying to get something done, you're trying to make something happen, and you're out asking people, can we do this, can we do that? And everyone's saying, no, it can't happen. And then all of a sudden something seems to shift. And if you're patient enough, and that's really interesting, I think it's like if you just sort of wait for the right moment, suddenly everything starts to happen. And it's like from the answer being a no, the answer starts to shift towards a yes, and suddenly you have the solution. Whatever it was that you were wanting, that you were looking for, that you were trying to resolve, has been resolved. And it was simply a matter of kind of waiting for the right moment. That wouldn't exist, I don't think, in many Western countries. I can think of maybe places like Spain, Portugal, but I think in most Western countries, if you say walk into a shop and you say, do you sell 6-inch nails, and the guy says no, you walk out of the shop. Whereas here you might do that, and you do sell 6-inch nails, and he might say no, and if you wait for the right moment, suddenly those 6-inch nails might materialize almost as if by magic. But it's a very different way of approaching a situation.
But it is the way things are done here, or like you're right, in maybe particularly southern Spain or Portugal, or I'm thinking Greece as well, which has had a sort of, a lot of the Mediterranean. There's this, I see it as a whole other frequency because people are not in a rush. Look, I went to the bank this morning to take out some money, and this is a branch of a bank that I go to quite a lot. I spent 5 minutes talking to the guard outside, asking him how his family are and how his life is he okay? Then I was received by the bank manager, and I talked to her, and then I got to the teller, and I hadn't got the money out yet, but I put in a bit of time with them because they're kind of friendly and I know them. And in so many ways, this is what the society is all about. It's about kind of paying into the system so then you get dividends later.
Yeah.
Everyone's lives are attached to each other. You can't live your sort of individual...
Atomized.
Not at all here.
Yeah.
Everything is connected with everyone else, and I think that's what's interesting. I mean, I recommend anyone get out of... If you're in a small community somewhere, that's fantastic. Live in that community for the rest of your life if you like it. But at the same time, have a breakout method. And I just heard something from my son Timur last night. He's in London, as you know, going to UCL. He joined a website because his mum, Rachna, has joined the same website. She's in India. And I'm only saying this now because it's just happened. This website, you join a website and you meet random people. I can't even remember what it's called. I'm sure people watching this are members and they're screaming at their phone, the name. And so, like Timur last night, and this is a difficult thing for him and his generation to do. He's 21, as you know, and he went to a room and had a conversation with a random number of people, random people from all backgrounds or whatever.
Not digitally, actually
no,
physically.
actually there in London. And what I can tell you something, when I heard this, I thought that is really interesting. Because when I think back to my childhood, which was, as you know, this place, Langton House, with my father, Idries Shah, and what he was trying to do, it was exactly that. I can tell you, I'm looking in my head of a table in a building that we called the Elephant, which you've heard of, which was a stone barn. And I can see faces from 35 years ago. The first one was, I won't say their names, but the first one was a barrister. The next one was an actor. The next one was a wheeler dealer, cloth merchant. The next one, what was he? I don't even know. The next two were ladies who had been with Gurdjieff. And we found out later they were celebrity ballerinas in their youth. They were ancient. The next one was a pianist. After that, an expert, world expert in sonics and noise. After that was one of the people who invented radar in World War II or just before. And there were all kinds of other people too. These were not the kind of people that I have come across much in the 30 years since. Yeah. But the fact that they were thrown together in a room month after month meant that they all rubbed off on each other. And yes, my dad was there as, I don't know, the grit in the ointment or whatever. But the fact was not about my father was being there. It was the fact that they were all there.
Yeah.
And I think that is an astonishing thing. So I think the College of Storytellers, for example, and this concept that we were all brought up with teaching stories and sharing anecdotes of our lives. But I love this idea of random connections within people, because I think, don't you think that we grow from that?
Well, it's interesting because, you and I, we've been talking about the concept of healing stories and the healing capacity of stories. And I'm wondering if that sort of multifaceted side of stories is part of the capacity that they have to help people with mental health issues, with depression, with all kinds of things. That it's this stretching, perhaps, of the brain, or making the brain work in a way, in a more natural way, less linear, more scattered way, scattered in a good sense. I don't mean sort of scatterbrained, but sort of that multiple like constellation of effects and impacts and thoughts and feelings that together form the whole. I'm wondering if maybe this is part of that healing side of stories.
Well, I think it's important to note that we have kind of called them healing stories, and we've identified this as an attribute of these teaching stories, wisdom stories, value stories, healing stories. In Morocco, or all points east of here, along this trajectory anyway, you'd never even have to call them healing stories, because everyone would know they're healing stories, because that's what stories are. Yeah. And I think back to my childhood, before exams, and I was terrible at exams, and I'm so dyslexic and I couldn't pay attention, and I would, I'd get into the exam hall and I'd be trying to scratch a label off the desk for most of the exam, because that's what I was deeply focused on. But I remember before my exams, my father would always give me, or usually read to me, several Nasrudin stories. And they were funny, and they were odd, and there were all kinds of things as well. And they'd work away at me, a bit like a little terrier dog worrying, working away at a rag toy. And they were kind of food for a part of my brain. I don't even know which part, but they had an effect that part of the brain needed to have done on it, Yeah. And I think it's fascinating that the world has suddenly woken up, although people like Professor Robert Ornstein were publishing this in the 60s and 70s, the two sides of the brain and how part of the brain works so much better. It's like adding oil to an engine. It works so much better if it's given certain material to work with. And what's so strange to me is that in a lot of the world, we have to all sort of sit down and say, yes, now we're going to tell teaching stories, and this is very serious and whatever. It's not serious at all, but it's humanity. You know what I mean?
It should just be part of the fabric of everyday life.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
I mean, I wish, and I think some schools probably do this, I wish stories were told before class in the morning. I think that seems obvious. I mean, look, I've got up here somewhere, our friend Doris Lessing, the novelist who won a Nobel at the end of her life, she wrote a monograph about stories and storytelling. I can feel it close to me, it's just up there. And in it, she said, I think at the beginning, she said she heard a good standard of literature and interesting stories every Sunday of her childhood at Sunday school.
Sunday school, yeah.
And it was, of course, it was the Old Testament, which is mostly kind of heavy-duty stories. Yeah. And of course it is, because if you're trying to get people to sit in Sunday school year after day after week, year after year, that's a very good way of doing it. And to pass on value ideas.
And these stories, I mean, because I noticed that, stories that were fed to me as a child, the Greek myths, some of the Bible stuff, Shakespeare, later on in life, you're in a situation, you come across another story. And I had this experience only the other night. So there's a new film out, I'm sure a lot of people have seen it, about Bob Dylan, called A Complete Unknown. And I'm intrigued by this film, because I'm thinking, why does this film work as a story? And then it kind of dawned on me that it's almost like a classic Messiah story. And it's almost like the story, it's very similar to the story of Jesus arriving in Jerusalem, and he's claimed as the Messiah, but then he sort of starts this revolution and everything kind of goes in a whole other direction that nobody saw. It's a bit maybe like the Napoleon, the outsider arriving in Paris and taking, sorting everything out, and again sort of moving things in a direction that nobody could see. So it's a sort of like an archetypal story. And so it was really interesting in this film, which is just about a singer-songwriter arriving in New York in the early 60s, seeing that story being told essentially, but with completely different characters in a completely different time. But so that story's there at the heart of it. And I think that's what makes it an interesting film.
And in so many ways, it's like one of, the classic stories that my father published in his life, like The Happiest Man in the World. A young man wanted to go and he wanted to study with a teacher, and the teacher said, "You're not ready to study. You've firstly got to go and search for the happiest man in the world. Go if you want to study with me, And he went on this huge journey, zigzagging for years and years, and he had to ask the happiest man in the world for his shirt to put it on. And eventually he comes to the happiest man in the world, who's wearing a huge turban and his face is partly concealed. And he is the happiest man in the world because tears are rolling down his cheeks and he can't stop laughing. And the young man, who's no longer so young, says, "Can I have your shirt?" And the man laughs even more and says, if you took a moment to notice, you'll see I'm not wearing a shirt. And then he pulls off his turban and reveals himself as the teacher that the young man wanted to study with originally. And I haven't seen the Bob Dylan film yet, but I'm imagining that it's this raw young man.
Yes.
Who needed experiences. And that is what life is about. Life, my friends, as I try to tell my children and others, anyone who will listen, life is most definitely, it's such a cliche, not about the destination. It's about the scar tissue received on the journey. And if we think back to our lives, the moments that have taught us stuff, they're usually something going wrong, so we learned something, and these are such powerful mirrors to the stories that we kind of rant on about, because we see they're learning mechanisms, in their own right.
And those stories can maybe help shed new light on those moments in our own lives. I mean, that seems to be something I think that happens to me, is that, you're in a certain situation and a part of it, partially or even completely, you'll go, oh, I'm in that situation. I'm in the situation of that story. Or it just helps you to see it in a whole new way and helps you maybe to get more out of that experience than you would have otherwise.
Absolutely. And not, something I'm totally preoccupied with my kids' generation is their generation who are more thoughtful, kinder, more brilliant, more educated, wiser, cleaner, better fed than my generation. But their generation, strangely, because possibly or partly, they're used to having technologies that solve problems in a very amazing way, especially stuff like ChatGPT and AI and calculators and internet. But they're used to writing in something and then getting an answer spewed out. They're not used to developing what I call the scar tissue of zigzag hardship and everything going wrong and falling to bits, which I think there's a danger zone here, because what is so important, as I've said, is to have a series of experiences that calibrate you and recalibrate you continually, like in a story. So in a story, it is not James woke up, he typed something in, he had a question, he typed it into ChatGPT, he got an answer, and he went back to bed. No, it is that an asteroid fell from the sky, life as we know it was blown to smithereens, and he had to, you know, go on this great journey and find answers for himself and problem solve. I think there's this, look, we're being wooed and wowed, you and me, by AI, and at the same time, I'm just sad that it could rob people of the opportunity of astonishing hardship of the journey.
But this brings us back to Scheherazade herself, right? This idea of calibration and recalibration, almost like a daily process. I mean, it's a nightly process for her, right? She's doing that with Shahryar.
Yeah.
She's having to tell the stories to him again and again and again. And it's almost, 1001 suggests that it's almost an endless, eternal process for the healing to take place, for Shahryar to come to his senses and lose the anger, lose that rage that he has against all women. And so it's this slow drip effect, which eventually, whilst it's working, he's not killing any more women, so it's having an effect. But the final solution of his anger issues doesn't come. It's almost like it's an eternal process. It's almost as if it would never end. Those stories could keep going and going and going.
And the ending is not the high point. I can't even remember the ending.
Right.
I've got 100 editions of 1001 Nights, and
yes, we don't remember the ending.
Right,
we
it
remember
doesn't
the
ever
stories.
say that they all lived happily ever after, because it's almost as if that would be awful. It would end it with a big red line. But I'm fascinated living in a society like this, though, where everyone knows Nasrudin, the comic fool of medieval folklore, who we call Nasrudin, here they call him Joha. And everyone knows the stories of King Hatim Tai and goodness, and everyone knows Anta wa Habla, and everyone, they don't just know this stuff, they have it. I mean, it's such a cliche to have it in their DNA and the marrow of their bones, but it's almost like a lens or a blueprint that they know how to behave, they know right and wrong, they know that there is always hope even when there is no hope, which in the West, I think, people get terribly depressed because the barometer is always happiness and perfection, and it's all, you look on Facebook, on Instagram and whatever, and it's beautiful people sipping cocktails or whatever. Everyone knows in a society like this, in Morocco, that most of it is the character in the story crawling across the desert, and he has no luck and everything is awful, belly up, pear-shaped, but suddenly he will find a bottle and he'll scratch the top off, and there'll either be water or, even better still, a jinn who will, change his life. I'm not saying that you have to believe in jinns, but I'm saying that these structures, these mechanisms that we know as stories, they provide a very, very rich kind of harmony that we can, that we can draw from and be inspired by.
So how do we go about getting these stories back into people's lives? I mean, there is a sense that people are losing touch with them. And we've done some research where it seems to suggest that quite a lot of stories are being lost on a yearly basis. Maybe as many as 500 traditional folk tales a year are being lost due to digitalization and globalization and all kinds of factors.
Well, as you know, our project that we've been working on for the last year and a half, the World Story Bank, which we began working on because we realized that something has to be done. Stories need to be gathered from all corners of the world, from all corners of a railway station, for God's sake. You don't have to cover much territory, but they need to be gathered. And more importantly, they need to be reseeded into society. The incredible thing, as you know, about stories and folklore is they are a mechanism that is particularly tailored and arranged to be taken up. They are almost like, I just got a flash in my head of being a kid and walking through a forest in England where I grew up, and I'd come back to the house and I'd be covered, my sweater would be covered in these seeds. Because these seeds, you know, the ones that kind of glue themselves to you, they are, I don't know what seeds they were, but they were engineered through, you know, probably centuries, millennia, to attach themselves. That's what stories do.
Yeah.
Stories attach themselves to us without us realizing. And because they're so damn good at attaching themselves to us, we don't even realize they're attaching themselves. We hear stories day in, day out, sometimes in newspapers, sometimes on social media, sometimes on the top deck of a bus when we're overhearing someone's conversation. And they kind of melt into our heads. And of course, they're having an effect. What we're obviously fascinated by and want to do is promote, actively promote stories with layers and complexities and values, and to work to reseed them, and particularly to take, you know, Armenian stories and seed them into the Upper Amazon, and Upper Amazon stories and seed them into Armenia and Kenyan stories in Siberia and so on. What we've seen is this is very easy to start. Okay, it's a difficult, big project, but it's easy to start because what you're working with is so delicious. It's not like trying to sell people, you know, salt who don't need salt. We're trying to sell something which is like the Holy Grail, and it is needed and delicious. And it's like, you know, it's like ice cream. Yeah. But I mean, you know, I think I told you a friend of mine who's an American actor was down in Marrakesh like a month ago, and he was filming the new Christopher Nolan film. And I like Christopher Nolan's films, but I was so happy when I learned that the film is the Odyssey, Odysseus and the Odyssey, and that Nolan isn't going to, you know, something from modern 20th century history. He's gone to the classic Greek myths. When I was a kid, I went to an awful English prep school. And look how I'm telling you this. I'm telling it almost like a story. I'm looking at myself, actually, telling you this. And that shows how we tell things. We paint a picture. And there was an English teacher, I won't name her, but she was really quite bizarre and awful. And she had a little bun on the back of her head. And she never ever smiled, not even once. And all the 6 years that I was a child there, she always scowled. And she never taught anything nice and always taught everything horrific and never gave anyone a compliment. But she did something for me that I have never forgotten. She, one term, read the Odyssey to us. And this woman was possibly the worst English teacher on the planet Earth. But I've got goosebumps thinking about it. She gave us the Odyssey, you know, and reading that book to us, she knew, being 9 or 10 that we were, that it would seep into every cell. And, you know, Circe and the Cyclops and the Sirens and Ithaca and the army and she knew this it would change the wiring, change our wiring, and it would make us different people, right?
It's interesting you mention that, because I remember that often we were, as kids at school, we were read to. And I don't think that's happening to my children in school in their English classes. I think they have they sit down and they read, but I don't think they have this thing where a teacher's reading a story to them. Because often I remember those stories, short stories that were read to us as kids, and then I come across them decades later as an adult and say, oh, this story, I remember this.
You know, it's totally sacred to me that's why I love audiobooks. It's a sacred thing to have someone reading. And you know me, I'm preoccupied with the idea of oral folklore rather than read and written. Obviously, Homer, it was oral. It was the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Greek myths. I've watched storytellers all over the world, and when you get a storyteller who can, this is what it's all about. It's about a storyteller who can look at the audience. The audience of a story is 10 times more important than the story. The audience, who is there, and how do I reconfigure the narrative that I've got in my head for these people. That is why it's no surprise to me that video games have this mesmeric effect on people, because you'll want to go through that door, so you open it and there's this whole other madness there. I'll go through that door, which you can't even see, but I'll know it's there, and I'll go through that and I'll receive something different. A storyteller who can accommodate the needs of his entire audience, which I've seen some very, very good storytellers. To call them good is awful, to put them down. Very skilled. And they're psychologists, and they're not writers or, thinkers. They're complex, psychologists.
And the great thing about stories, I think, when they're told, is that we remember them. I had this interesting, actually you were there when we went to a conference near Madrid a couple of years ago, and it was quite worthy and it was very interesting. Various people were talking about all kinds of sort of high-powered subjects, but my only memory of anything that anyone actually said was somebody told a Zen story.
I remember it.
Yeah, about the Zen master. He's an archer, and he goes into the forest one day. He's spent 20 years becoming the greatest Zen archer ever, and he goes into the forest and he finds these targets on trees, and they're all bullseyes. They're all absolutely perfect, and he's just totally bowled over by this because he thinks, I've never ever reached this kind of a level. I need to find the person who is this greatest Zen archer master. And he finds this woman and he says, is it you? She says, yes. And he says, how do you do it? She says, well, I fire the arrow first and then I paint the target around the arrow wherever the arrow falls. Right? So I remember that story.
Me too. And it's been going around my head since then.
Yeah.
And I've told it to people, and actually I've told it to people in different ways, depending on who they are and my mood at the time, and all kinds of stuff as well. Okay. And I think that's what's so important. I think often, in the Occidental world, people get quite anxious about telling a story and making a performance and being singled out. And really, like we're saying, with our kids' generation, about not being as perfect as you could be. And what I love in, I'll call it the Eastern world, which is a lot of the other world, and most of it is not even East. It's the sense that you can just present something as a mini little Nasrudin or a mini little nugget of humorous wisdom, or being, self-deprecating rather than grand. But you can just spew something out in order to make a point, or teach a story, make a point, and not for it to be incredible. That person, it was a woman, I think you said, that's right, who gave the Zen story. It was very polished and very perfect. But what I'm trying to say is a story doesn't even have to be that. It can even be a fragment of a story. It can be, you know, a tiny bit of a much larger thing. And that's why I love, you know, collections like The 1001 Nights, because some of the stories are just, you know, a third of a page long, but they are more impactful than the longer ones. You know, and that's something about, well, look at that. My father's publication in the late 60s, The Book of the Book, which is about content versus container. And the Book of the Book, I think it's 17 or 19 pages of text, but mostly blank pages. And that points out to people that you have to use your head in a different way. And you have to really throw out most of what you've, until this point, taken as important or rote, and learn to rethink. And I think at Scheherazade Foundation, what we're trying to do, not in any sort of arrogant way, but we're trying to recalibrate and rethink ourselves, society, anyone we brush up against. And that's what I love about what we've been doing so far, that we grab hold of projects or champion stuff or sometimes fun stuff. And it's stuff that we find deeply fascinating. But to me, in any case, it's about, and I think to you, it's about looking through the eyes of Scheherazade in the story and looking different, looking at things differently. But because, well, it may be a different way to look at things, but from my point of view, it's the most perfect way to perceive something. You know, it might be looking at that desk over there from underneath it with one eye open and one eye closed. But it's a kind of way that changes us from the inside out.